The bell above the door jingled as Anthony stepped into Molly's diner on a bright Tuesday afternoon. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. His stomach grumbled. He hadn't eaten since early morning, when he'd rushed out the door to teach his first class at the community college. Now, with his afternoon lectures still ahead, he needed a good meal to keep going. The diner was buzzing with the regular lunch crowd. Plates clattered and conversations hummed as Anthony looked around for an empty spot. This was his first time at Molly's, though he passed by it often during his 3 weeks in town. Moving to a new place was always tough, but this small town had seemed welcoming enough when he'd accepted the teaching position. "Sit anywhere you like, honey," called an older waitress from behind the counter, not really looking up from the orders she was sorting. Anthony nodded with a smile and headed toward a booth by the window. The red vinyl seats squeaked as he settled in, placing his worn leather satchel beside him. Inside were student papers he needed to grade before tomorrow. He'd been teaching American literature at the college for just a few weeks, but already his students were showing real promise. The sunlight streamed through the window, warming his face as he unbuttoned his navy blazer. He was dressed simply but professionally. He believed in setting an example for his students. His father had always told him, "Dress for the job you want, not the job you have." That advice had served him well through the years. As Anthony reached for the menu tucked behind the napkin holder, he noticed a few glances from the other customers. Being new in a small town meant being noticed, especially when you looked different from most folks around. He was used to it by now, the curious looks, the slight hesitation. 20 years of being the new guy in predominantly white spaces had taught him to keep his head high and his mind focused on what mattered. The laminated menu featured classic diner fare, burgers, sandwiches, and all-day breakfast options. His eyes landed on the Turkey Club special. Perfect. As he waited for service, Anthony pulled out some student essays, figuring he might get through one or two while waiting for his food. The essay on top was from a quiet student named Lee who sat in the back of the classroom, but always had insightful comments when encouraged to speak. Anthony smiled as he read the opening paragraph. The kid had real talent. First time here. Anthony looked up to see an older man at the next booth, maybe in his 70s, with weathered hands and kind eyes. "Yes, sir. Just moved to town a few weeks ago," Anthony replied, putting the essay down. "Teaching at the college, I bet. You got that professor look," the man chuckled. "I'm Ray. Been coming here for breakfast every day since '86. "Anthony, nice to meet you." They exchanged a quick handshake across the narrow space between booths. "The Turkey Club is good, but the meatloaf is what you want," Ray advised with a wink before turning back to his newspaper. The brief interaction warmed Anthony. Small moments of connection like this helped ease the loneliness of being new in town. He had left behind friends, favorite restaurants, and familiar streets to take this position, hoping it would lead to the tenure-track job he'd been working toward for years. Around him, the diner continued its lunchtime symphony. The sizzle from the grill, clinking silverware, the cash register's distinctive ping, and snippets of conversation about local sports teams and town council decisions. A group of construction workers laughed heartily at a table in the corner. 2 elderly women shared pie and gossip by the counter. A mother tried to convince her young son to be his vegetables. Anthony returned to reading Lee's essay, circling a particularly well-crafted sentence with his red pen. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't immediately notice when the atmosphere in the diner subtly shifted. A waitress was approaching his table, her face set in a tight expression that didn't match the friendly environment of the place. As she reached his booth, Anthony looked up with a ready smile, completely unaware that this ordinary lunch was about to become anything but ordinary. The waitress stopped at Anthony's table, her name-tag reading Diane. She'd been working at Molly's diner for nearly 15 years, long enough to know every regular customer by name and order. Her usually warm smile was nowhere to be seen today. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone clipped. Her pen hovered over her notepad, but her eyes never quite met Anthony's. "Good afternoon," Anthony replied pleasantly, setting aside his student's essay. "I'd like the Turkey Club, please, and a glass of iced tea." Diane scribbled down his order without the friendly chatter she'd been offering other customers. Anthony noticed her laugh with the elderly couple 2 booths over just minutes ago, asking about their grandchildren. Now, her face had hardened into something unreadable. "That'll be $12.75, she said flatly. Anthony looked up, confused. "Sorry?" "Your meal. It's $12.75. We'll need you to pay now, before we put in your order." Her voice carried just enough for nearby tables to hear. The couple seated closest to Anthony suddenly became very interested in their soup. A man at the counter stopped mid-bite of his pie. The usual dining noise seemed to dim as people began to notice what was happening. "I don't understand," Anthony said quietly. "Is that a new policy for everyone?" He glanced around the diner. No one else had paid before eating. The construction workers had just gotten their burgers. The women by the counter were still working on their pie, bills nowhere in sight. "It's just how we do things with certain customers," Diane replied, her emphasis making the implication clear. Anthony felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the heavy feeling he'd experienced many times before. At the car dealership where the salesman asked if he could really afford the sedan. At the department store where security followed him through the aisles. At the faculty meeting where someone assumed he was part of the custodial staff. The diner had fallen uncomfortably quiet. Ray, the friendly older man from the next booth, looked over with a frown forming on his weathered face. The cook behind the counter had paused to watch. Even a teenage busboy had stopped clearing a table, dirty plates balanced in his hands. Anthony took a slow, steady breath. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Your dignity isn't negotiable, son. But how you defend it is your choice." He could walk out. He'd done that before. Or he could cause a scene. He'd seen others do that, sometimes with good reason. But neither option would change anything. "I've been coming to this diner for 30 years, a customer spoke up from across the room, and I've never had to pay before eating." A murmur of agreement spread through the diner. Anthony remained silent, watching as Diane shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "Look," Diane said, lowering her voice but standing her ground, "we've had some problems with people walking out without paying. It's just a precaution." "Which people exactly?" asked Ray, folding his newspaper deliberately. "Because Phil and Tom there just got served without paying first." He nodded toward the construction workers. Diane's face flushed. Some customers looked away, embarrassed by the situation but unwilling to intervene further. Others watched with open disapproval in their eyes, directed not at Anthony, but at Diane. Anthony reached for his wallet. His hands were steady even as he felt a mix of emotions: anger, resignation, determination. He'd faced this moment before in different places with different faces. Each time, he had to decide how to respond in a way that preserved his dignity without reinforcing stereotypes about angry black men. "I'll pay now," he said finally, his voice calm but clear enough for everyone to hear. He placed his credit card on the table. "And after my meal, I'd like to speak with the owner, please." The diner remained unnaturally quiet as Diane took his card. Her hands trembled slightly, perhaps from anger, perhaps from shame at being called out, perhaps from the realization that every eye in the place was watching her. What happened next would change everything, not just for Anthony and Diane, but for everyone witnessing this moment in Molly's dinner. The tension in the diner hung thick in the air as Diane took Anthony's credit card and walked away to process the payment. Anthony sat perfectly still, his expression calm despite the storm of emotions inside him. Years of similar experiences had taught him how to wear this mask, this composed exterior that revealed nothing of the hurt and anger beneath. Anthony glanced down at the student essays he'd been grading. Lee's thoughtful analysis of Langston Hughes' poetry now seemed ironically fitting. What happens to a dream deferred? Hughes had written. Anthony had spent his life refusing to let his dreams dry up or explode, instead channeling his experiences into his teaching, helping students understand the complex realities of American society. Diane returned with his receipt and credit card, sliding them onto the table without meeting his eyes. "Your order will be ready shortly," she mumbled before hurrying away to another table, where she instantly transformed back into the friendly, chatty server she'd been with everyone else. An older woman seated near the counter kept watching the situation unfold, her coffee forgotten in front of her. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and the wrinkles around her eyes suggested both laughter and tears over many decades of life. There was something familiar about her that Anthony couldn't quite place. "Mind if I join you?" Anthony looked up to see Ray standing beside his booth, coffee mug in hand. "Please." Anthony gestured to the seat across from him. Ray settled in with a small grunt, his joints protesting after 70-some years of use. "That wasn't right," he said without preamble. "What Diane did." Anthony nodded slightly but didn't reply immediately. He'd learned to be careful about whom to trust in these situations. Sometimes apparent allies had their own agendas. "I've lived in this town my whole life," Ray continued, his weathered hands cupping his coffee mug. "Seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so good. But that kind of behavior," he shook his head. The cook called out an order from the kitchen window, the normal rhythm of the diner continuing around them, though several customers still cast glances their way. "It happens," Anthony said finally, "more often than most people realize." "Doesn't make it right," Ray insisted. "This town's better than that, or at least it should be." Anthony appreciated the man's sincerity but had heard similar sentiments before, rarely followed by actual change. "I found it's not about the town or the restaurant," he explained. "It's about individuals making choices, some good, some bad." A young waitress, not Diane, approached with Anthony's iced tea, setting it down with a warm smile. "Your sandwich will be ready in just a minute, sir," she said before walking away. Ray nodded toward her retreating figure. "Like I said, some good." Anthony took a sip of his tea, considering his next move. He could simply eat his meal, leave, and never return to Molly's diner again. It would be easier that way, but nothing would change. "I meant what I said about speaking to the owner," Anthony told Ray. "Do you know if they're here today?" "Joe's always here. Back office probably." Ray pointed toward a hallway near the restrooms. "Been running this place for almost 30 years. The silver-haired woman who had been watching earlier stood up now and walked deliberately toward their table. Her posture was straight despite her years, and she moved with purpose. The few customers still watching the situation straightened slightly as she approached, clearly someone of respect in the community. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said, her voice firm but kind. "I'm Dorothy Phillips. I taught at the high school for 40 years before retiring." Anthony introduced himself, offering his hand, which she shook firmly. "What happened to you just now isn't acceptable," Dorothy said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Not in this diner, not in this town." Her clear statement, made without hesitation or embarrassment, created a ripple effect through the restaurant. A few people nodded in agreement. Others looked ashamed. Diane, taking an order at another table, froze momentarily. Mrs. Phillips was marching for civil rights when the rest of us were still figuring out which end was up, Ray explained with obvious respect. "Nobody argues with Dorothy Phillips." Anthony felt something shift in the atmosphere of the diner. Dorothy's presence had changed the dynamic from uncomfortable bystanders to active witnesses. Sometimes, he knew, all it took was one person willing to stand up and be counted. "I believe your sandwich is coming," Dorothy said, nodding toward the kitchen where the young waitress was picking up a plate. "And after you eat, I'd like to join you when you speak with Joe, if you don't mind the company." The young waitress placed Anthony's Turkey Club sandwich on the table with a friendly smile. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, clearly unaware of what had happened earlier. "This is perfect, thank you," Anthony replied. The sandwich looked delicious, toasted bread piled high with turkey, bacon, lettuce, and tomato, with a generous serving of crispy fries on the side. As the waitress walked away, Dorothy sat down next to Ray, across from Anthony. "You eat," she insisted. "No sense letting good food go cold while we talk." Anthony took a bite of his sandwich, suddenly aware of how hungry he was after his long morning of teaching. The food was actually quite good, which made the situation all the more frustrating. Under different circumstances, this could have become his regular lunch spot. Dorothy sipped her water and watched Anthony thoughtfully. "You're new to our town, aren't you?" "Teaching at the college." Anthony nodded, swallowing his bite. "Started 3 weeks ago, American literature." "Wonderful subject." Dorothy's eyes lit up. "I taught English at the high school for decades. Still run the book club at the library." She leaned forward slightly. but I suspect literature isn't what we need to discuss right now. The front door of the diner opened, and a family with 2 small children entered. The normal buzz of conversation had mostly resumed, though several customers still glanced occasionally toward Anthony's table. "This happens a lot?" Ray asked, his voice lower now. Anthony considered how to answer. These conversations were always tricky, explaining racism to people who hadn't experienced it without making them defensive. "More often than you might think," he finally said. "Sometimes it's obvious, like being asked to pay up front. Sometimes it's subtle, being seated near the kitchen, getting slower service, extra scrutiny." Dorothy nodded knowingly. "I saw plenty during the 60s and 70s. Thought we'd made more progress than this." She sighed, then straightened her shoulders. "But sitting around feeling disappointed doesn't change anything." Anthony took another bite of his sandwich, appreciating Dorothy's practical attitude. Most of his life, he'd navigated these waters alone, choosing his battles carefully. Having unexpected allies felt both strange and comforting. The kitchen door swung open, and a man in his late 50s emerged. He wore a white apron over a blue button-down shirt, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. He was speaking to the cook about an order when his eyes scanned the diner and landed on their table. "That's Joe," Ray explained. "Owns the place." Dorothy waved, catching Joe's attention. He nodded in acknowledgement and finished his conversation with the cook before making his way toward them. "Dorothy, Ray," Joe greeted them warmly. "Good to see you both." He turned to Anthony with a friendly smile. "Don't think we've met. I'm Joe Molina, owner of this fine establishment." "Anthony Wilson," he replied, wiping his hand on a napkin before shaking Joe's extended hand. "I'm new in town. Teaching at the college." "Welcome to our community," Joe said. "How's the sandwich?" "The food is excellent," Anthony said honestly. "The service, however—" Joe's smile faltered slightly, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem?" Dorothy didn't hesitate. "Diane made him pay up front, Joe. Nobody else in the diner, just him." Joe's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to concern in the span of seconds. He pulled a chair from a nearby empty table and sat down at the end of the booth. "Was Diane your server?" he asked Anthony directly. Anthony nodded. "She told me it was policy for certain customers to pay before eating." Joe's face darkened. "That is absolutely not our policy." He looked genuinely distressed. "Never has been, never will be." A few nearby diners were watching this conversation unfold, including the teenage busboy who had paused his work to listen. "I don't doubt you," Anthony said carefully. "But it happened all the same." The weight of what Anthony left unsaid hung in the air between them. This wasn't about policy, it was about prejudice. Dorothy placed her aged hand on the table. "Joe, we've known each other 30 years. You're a good man running a good business. But something happened here today that needs addressing." Joe nodded slowly, the responsibility of the situation settling on his shoulders. "You're right, Dorothy." "Absolutely right." He turned back to Anthony. "Sir, I can't change what happened, but I promise you it doesn't reflect my values or how I run my business." Anthony studied Joe's face, seeing sincerity there. He'd become good at reading people over the years, a necessary skill when navigating situations like this. "I believe you," Anthony said. "But what happens now? That's the real question." Joe rubbed his forehead, the lines of worry deepening on his face. "First, I want to apologize to you, Anthony. What happened shouldn't have happened. Not in my diner." Anthony nodded, appreciating the straightforward apology. Too often, people danced around these situations with excuses or deflections. "We've had a few walkouts recently," Joe continued. "People ordering meals and leaving without paying. I mentioned it to the staff last week, told them to keep an eye out." He shook his head. "But I never said anything about making people pay up front, and certainly not based on—" He trailed off, uncomfortable with naming the obvious. "Based on race," Anthony finished for him. The words hung in the air, honest and unavoidable. Dorothy took a sip of her water. "Naming it matters, Joe. Can't fix what we won't acknowledge." Joe nodded. "You're right." He looked directly at Anthony. "Diane discriminated against you because you're black. There's no excuse for that." The teenage busboy, who had been lingering nearby wiping the same table for several minutes, stopped pretending not to listen. A couple at a nearby booth exchanged glances. "I need to speak with Diane," Joe said, looking around the diner. "But first, I want you to know that your meal today is on the house." Anthony shook his head. "I don't want a free meal. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to the next black customer who walks through that door." Ray nodded approvingly. The older man had been quiet, but his presence added weight to the conversation, another longtime community member witnessing this moment of truth. Joe straightened his shoulders. "You're absolutely right." He waved to the young waitress. "Lisa, have you seen Diane?" "I think she's in the break room," Lisa replied, glancing nervously between Joe and Anthony. "Would you ask her to come out here, please?" Joe's tone was firm, but not angry. Lisa nodded and disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors. The diner had grown quieter again, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Anthony finished the last bite of his sandwich, grateful for the momentary distraction. He hadn't come to Molly's diner looking for this situation. All he'd wanted was lunch between classes. "You teach American literature?" Joe asked, clearly trying to ease the tension while they waited. "Yes, just started this semester," Anthony replied. "My daughter's at the college. Pre-med. Works herself too hard." Joe smiled slightly, but she loves it. This simple exchange, this normal conversation between two people, was exactly what Anthony had been denied when Diane approached his table with prejudice instead of the same basic respect she showed other customers. The kitchen doors swung open again. Lisa returned, followed by Diane, whose face paled when she saw the gathering at Anthony's table. She approached slowly, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "Diane," Joe said evenly, "we need to talk about what happened earlier with Professor Wilson here." Diane's eyes darted around, looking everywhere but at Anthony. "I was just being careful, like you said, about the walkouts. I never told anyone to make certain customers pay up front." Joe's voice remained calm but firm. "And I certainly never suggested treating people differently based on how they look." Diane's face flushed. "It wasn't like that," she protested weakly. "Then what was it like?" Dorothy asked, her tone gentle but unyielding. As a former teacher, she knew how to ask questions that couldn't be dodged. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the cook had paused to watch through the kitchen window. Diane struggled for words. "We've had problems with, I thought." "You thought what?" Anthony asked quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time since the incident. Something in his calm dignity seemed to deflate Diane's defensiveness. Her shoulders slumped slightly. "I made assumptions," she admitted finally, "and that was wrong." It wasn't a full acknowledgement, but it was a start. Anthony had seen enough of these moments to know that real change rarely happened in a single conversation. It was a process, often uncomfortable, always necessary. 30 years in education taught me something," Dorothy said, looking around at everyone gathered. "People make mistakes. The important thing is what happens next." Joe nodded firmly. "What happens next is we make this right." He turned to Diane. "I need you in my office after your shift. For now, Lisa will take over your tables." Diane nodded stiffly and walked away, the weight of the moment visible in her posture. "And what happens after that?" Anthony asked. This was always the crucial question, whether the moment would lead to lasting change or be forgotten once the discomfort passed. Joe leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What happens next is up to all of us," he said. "But I can tell you what I'm going to do." His voice carried the weight of someone making a public commitment. "First, I'm going to have a serious talk with my entire staff, not just Diane." Anthony nodded. He'd heard similar promises before, but something in Joe's determined expression suggested he meant it. "I don't think Diane is a bad person," Joe continued. "But what happened today was wrong, plain and simple. She needs to understand that." "Sometimes good people carry bad ideas without even realizing it," Dorothy added. "Ideas they picked up along the way, never questioning them." A few heads nodded among the nearby customers. The conversation had created a ripple effect through the diner. People who had been silent observers were now engaged, some speaking quietly at their own tables about what they were witnessing. "I'd like to offer a suggestion," Anthony said. He hadn't planned on becoming involved beyond addressing the immediate incident, but something about the genuine concern he saw in Joe's face made him want to help find a real solution. I teach a course on diverse perspectives in American literature. Part of what we discuss is how bias shows up in everyday interactions. Joe looked interested. You think you could talk to my staff about this? I could, Anthony replied. But more importantly, I think this could be a conversation for the whole community, not just your diner. Ray, who had been quiet for some time, spoke up. The community center hosts events every month. Been trying to get more folks to come. He looked at Dorothy. You're on the board then, aren't you? Dorothy's eyes brightened. I am indeed. And we've been looking for meaningful programming. She turned to Anthony. Would you consider leading a discussion there? Something open to local businesses and residents. The teenage busboy, who had given up any pretense of not listening, stepped closer. Could high school students come too? He asked. We have a social justice club, but we mostly just talk to ourselves. Anthony felt something unexpected unfold. What had begun as a hurtful incident was transforming into an opportunity, not just for a one-time discussion, but for real community connection. I'd be happy to help organize something, he said, though I think the conversation would be richer if it included multiple voices and experiences. Lisa, the young waitress, had returned to refill their water glasses. Diane's pretty upset in the break room, she said quietly to Joe. She says she wants to apologize but doesn't know how. Joe looked at Anthony. Would you be willing to hear her out? Only if you're comfortable, of course. Anthony thought about it. These moments were always difficult. The apologies often more about easing the apologizer's guilt than offering real amends. Yet they were sometimes necessary first steps. I'll talk with her, he decided. A few minutes later, Diane approached the table again. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture hesitant. The confidence she'd shown earlier had evaporated. I'm sorry, she said simply. What I did was wrong. She took a shaky breath. I'd worked here 15 years and never thought of myself as someone who would do something like that. Anthony nodded, acknowledging her words without immediately absolving her. Thank you for saying that. I don't expect you to forgive me, Diane continued. But I want you to know I'm going to do better. She glanced at Joe. If I still have a job, that is. You do, Joe affirmed. But things are going to change around here. Dorothy smiled slightly. Change is hard, but necessary. Been through plenty of it in my 82 years. The front door of the diner opened and a group of college students entered, laughing together. One of them spotted Anthony and waved. Professor Wilson, your American Lit class changed my whole perspective last week. The young woman approached their table, oblivious to the situation she was walking into. Sorry to interrupt your lunch, but I wanted to tell you how much I loved that Baldwin essay you assigned. I'd never read anything like it before. Anthony smiled genuinely for the first time since entering the diner. I'm glad it resonated with you, Becky. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts in class tomorrow. Becky nodded enthusiastically before joining her friends at a large table. As she walked away, Dorothy watched with approval. That right there, she said quietly, is why all of this matters. Minds opening, perspectives changing. She looked at Joe and Diane. That's what education does, and not just in classrooms. 6 months later, Anthony pushed open the door to Molly's diner, the familiar bell jingling above his head. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon welcomed him, along with something that hadn't been there during his first visit, a sense of belonging. Professor Wilson, Joe called from behind the counter. Your usual table is open. Anthony smiled and waved as he made his way to the window booth that had become his regular spot 3 mornings a week before his early classes. The diner looked different now. Colorful artwork from local artists decorated the walls, including several pieces from the college's student gallery. Lisa approached with a steaming coffee pot. Morning, Professor. Sleep well. As well as anyone can before an 8 a.m. lecture, Anthony replied with a chuckle. How did your history exam go yesterday? Lisa had enrolled in the community college part-time after being inspired by the community discussions that had started in the months following the incident. I think I aced it, she said proudly, pouring his coffee. Those study tips you gave me really helped. Anthony opened his worn leather satchel, pulling out papers to review before his morning class. So much had changed since that uncomfortable first lunch at Molly's. What could have ended with him simply never returning had instead sparked something unexpected in the small town. The bell jingled again as Dorothy entered, accompanied by her book club friends. At 82, she moved a bit slower these days, but retained every bit of her sharp mind and determined spirit. "There he is," she announced to her friends. "The man who turned our monthly community talks from 5 bored people to standing room only." Anthony shook his head modestly. "Pretty sure that was your doing, Dorothy." "I just showed up." Dorothy slid into the booth across from him, her friends taking the table next to them. "Don't sell yourself short. People needed to hear what you had to say, and more importantly, they needed someone who would listen to them too." The monthly community discussions at the center had indeed grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a conversation about unconscious bias had expanded into an ongoing dialogue about building a more inclusive community. People from all walks of town life attended: business owners, teachers, high school students, retirees. Some came to share experiences, others to learn, all to connect. The kitchen door swung open, and Diane emerged carrying plates for another table. She looked different somehow, more at ease with herself. After their difficult beginning, Anthony had watched her work hard to confront her own biases. It hadn't been easy or comfortable, but she'd stayed the course. Diane caught his eye and gave a small wave, which Anthony returned. Their relationship would never be close, but it had evolved into something built on mutual respect, proof that people could change when given the chance and motivation. "Here's today's special," Joe said, approaching the table with a plate of blueberry pancakes. "On the house." "Joe, we've been through this," Anthony protested good-naturedly. "You can't keep giving me free food." "Who said it's about you?" Joe grinned. "These are actually for Dorothy. You just happen to be sitting at her table." Dorothy laughed, her eyes twinkling. "He's learning this one." The teenage busboy, now promoted to weekend cook, poked his head out from the kitchen. "Professor Wilson, did you see the article in the town paper about our high school social justice club? We got funding for that project." "I did see it, Tyler. Really impressive work," Anthony replied. The high school students had designed a local history project, interviewing older residents about how the town had changed over the decades. Joe's daughter entered the diner, spotting Anthony immediately. "Dad, is it okay if Professor Wilson and I talk about my application essay for a few minutes before his class?" "I made the changes he suggested." "Of course, Lily," Joe replied proudly. His daughter's interest in medical ethics had blossomed after attending several community discussions. As Anthony moved his papers aside to make room for Lily, he caught sight of Ray entering the diner. The older man now led a veterans discussion group that met after the monthly community talks. Another unexpected ripple effect. Anthony sometimes marveled at how a single moment of confronting bias had transformed not just the diner, but created waves throughout the community. There was still work to be done. Change never happened overnight. But looking around the busy diner at the connections being formed, the conversations happening, and the genuine warmth with which he was now greeted, Anthony felt something profound: hope.